Hello, everybody. Welcome on. Welcome to our Bewitched Heart 3D cookie workshop. I'm so excited for today. Let's see, I'm just going to make sure that everything is working good, and then we will get started. All right, let's check here. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Hello, hello, test, test. Mom's checking for sound. Okay, good. All right. So I'm just going to wait a second for anybody who's going to watch live to jump on. But remember, you guys will also get the replay of this if you're watching the replay. Hello as well. And so I'm just going to walk through all of my steps for these style cookies and show you everything from baking and kind of getting it ready to bake to painting and decorating and all that fun stuff for my Bewitched 3D heart cookies. I've been doing these for like oddities markets, and I just really like anything that's a little bit different, a little bit more unique and alternative, especially for Valentine's Day. I just think it is such a fun opportunity to do something a little bit different, but cutesy is always fun too, but it's nice to have a little bit of everything, especially for my style. I love, maybe a little bit more horror inspired, so I thought that I would do these 3D cookies. I have one that is made, it's not painted yet, but I do have this one here that we are going to be painting later, but you can see the 3D cookie, and I'm going to show you everything that I can about making these, from designing them to just going ahead and painting them and decorating them and getting them ready to sell. If you're going to do it for markets and orders and things like that, or of course for friends and family as well. All right, perfect. Yes, we do have the comment section on this YouTube Live, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And if you're watching the replay or you're watching live and you just think of something later, remember you can always send me a message on Facebook, Instagram, email, anything like that is great. And I will be happy to answer any questions about this specific workshop or the techniques that I used in it. All right, perfect. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and just jump right in and get started for this project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the molds and things that I'm using. So of course, we have a lot of CME molds over here. This is our newer mold that we kind of came out with for this project. So this is inspired by Anatomical Heart. I did sculpt this one from scratch from clay, and then Mom makes all of our molds from scratch as well by hand. So it's not going to be 100% anatomical, but it is just an artistic inspiration or artistically inspired by an anatomical heart of just kind of my creative view of it. So we do have that mold.
And yellow, depending on what silicone we can source.
Oh, yeah. So your mold might be white, your mold might be yellow, like Mom said, depending on the silicone we can source at that time. But we have our heart mold that I'm going to be using, and then also our small oval frame. And I use this a lot for different projects because I just love the size of it and how pretty it is, especially for cookies. So these are going to be a really pretty kind of ornate cookie that you can definitely make. They will take a little bit more time than just, a roll and cut cookie. But as far as the decorating, actually takes way less time than like piping and flooding and doing all the little details. So I'm going to kind of balance it out that way, where, maybe the preparation takes a little bit longer, but the decoration is going to take less time. So that's how I like to do my cookies. And I really like to do cookies like this because they're a little bit more unique and different and, stand out from the crowd. It's good to always have a lot of different kind of techniques in your arsenal. So I thought I would show you guys my take on that. So I'm using those 3D molds for the cookies themselves. You can really use lots of different molds, though, for this, like any little critters or different things that you want to put inside of the frame. I'm also going to pair it with this sword mold from KD2 Designs. So you can see that it has, there we go, trying to get it to focus, those two different size swords. So I'm going to use that one as well because I love that mixed with the heart. I just think it makes it really fun, kind of has like a fantasy inspired to it. So I'm going to use those on my cookies. So the first step is going to be showing you how I get those all ready and prepped to go. Right, so I'm going to tilt my camera down here so you guys can see what I'm doing. All right, a little bit of ice mold on my table there. Okay. So I have my molds here, and I'm going to prep them with a little bit of flour first. So the flour is going to go in the mold to make sure that it is going to be nice and non-stick. Now, silicone already is non-stick, but just because our molds have so much detail to them, we just want to make sure that they are going to be really, really kind of prepped to make sure that they're going to release nicely. So I just sprinkle a little bit of flour, and then I tap it around. You can also use a paintbrush to help push it around. And I'm just going to kind of tap that around, and then sometimes I'll dump the excess flour out, but depending on the mold and how detailed it is, I will leave that excess flour in, so you can play around with that. But for this one, I'm not really going to dump too much of the excess flour out because I don't want it to fill the details, but I do just want to make sure that there is enough in there. So it just takes a little bit of kind of trial and error for that, but I'm going to do that for all of the molds. Okay. So especially with this heart here, there's lots of little details and nooks and crannies. And when using really detailed molds like this, sometimes you can have pieces that come off, but that's really okay because I'm going to show you my trick to kind of make sure that they all refuse during the baking process. And again, this one, I'm not really going to tap out the excess flour. I'm actually going to try and push it towards the little, I guess, ventricles atop the kind of heart here, the little tubes coming off of it, because that's going to be the area that's going to stick the most. All right. And then a little bit in this one. And you can do this with any of our silicone molds, which is really fun. So I'm just going to add that into both of them. This big one's a little bit easier to do, so I'll probably just do that one, but you can definitely do either. Same thing with that. I'm just going to tap out some of that flour for that one because it is so tiny. I don't want to fill too many of little areas here, and then you can use the brush kind of stippling and brushing it around to make sure that it's all just filled in nicely. All right. So I'm using my cookie dough recipe here. It's just a kind of non-spread or kind of low spread or no spread cookie dough. You can use any flavor. I did these with like pumpkin spice. You can use my sculpted gingerbread recipe if you want to, which is on my website. That one is not going to be quite as like tasty. It's still all edible, but it's more so for construction or for display pieces. So if you're making this more for a display, I'd use something like that. But this is just a regular like roll and cut cookie dough. And so what I'm going to do for this frame is I have a little bit of a trick to it because the center area, we do want it filled with cookie, but we don't want it to have that raised area. So you see how the center is a lot higher up than the frame on the outside. So we are going to do this in two pieces. So I'm first just going to roll out some of my cookie dough here. And I'm going to kind of try and make the joint over here on the corner so that it's less likely to snap or break in the unmolding process. All right, and I'm just going to kind of push this into all the details. I like to use kind of the heel of my hand here and just go around in a circle. And I'm trying to kind of look at the edges and make sure that there's nothing that's overhanging. I can take some of it out if it looks like I overfilled it a little bit, but I think that's looking pretty good. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Now, this is a fairly deep mold because I also wanted to be able to do chocolate or ice mold or whatever I'm going to be doing. But with cookie, you don't want it to be too deep or too thick. Otherwise, it won't cook in the center. So what I do is I make this a little bit concave. So what I mean by that is I'm actually filling up the sides of the mold, but I'm not necessarily putting a ton of cookie dough in the middle. So it might have a slight hollow area. And I'm just pushing pieces of that dough. And I'm using a lot of dough, and then I can always remove some of it by kind of scraping it outwards with my finger. And I almost want to reinforce any areas that I know will be weak. So that'll take some trial and error with whichever kind of design of mold that you're doing. But with this one, I know it's those little tubes at the top. So I'm trying to make sure that there's plenty in that area. And just pushing that dough so that it's a little bit indented. So you see it kind of goes up the sides, but it doesn't necessarily fill all the way to the top in the center. Okay. And then doing the same thing with the little swords. Okay, so I'm just going to push that in, and then I'm kind of using my finger to just scrape using the top edge of the mold as a kind of almost blade here. No pun intended with these swords. And I'm just kind of pushing that dough away. So you see this is kind of the part that takes a little bit more time than just a standard kind of roll out and cut cookie. But when I go to decorate them, I like to airbrush these. You could hand paint them as well, but airbrushing is just so much faster. And I can do a whole tray of these in, just a couple of minutes. So that's really kind of where you save your time. Okay. So I just make sure that's nice and filled out. Now we want to freeze these to be able to get them out of the molds or before we bake them in general. So we have a couple of options when you are baking in molds. So when you're baking, you can either bake in the mold itself. So all of our molds here and this Katie Sue mold are high heat because they can work with isomalt and things like that, which means you can actually bake in them. So if you're doing a showpiece or something that you want the maximum amount of detail preserved in the piece, I would bake it right in the mold. So you put that right on your cookie sheet, put it in the oven, and then bake it. But because we want to be able to do multiples of these, like if I was doing a whole bunch of these cookies, I want to be able to bake them all at once. And because we're going to actually be assembling these into one final cookie with all the different elements before we bake it, then I also need to take them out. So what we want to do regardless, if you are taking them out or leaving them in, is you want to freeze the dough. Freezing the dough also helps it to maintain the most amount of detail that you possibly can. I'm going to freeze these for about 15 minutes before we go ahead and move on to what the baking process would be. So I do have a couple that are pre-made, but I am going to grab, let me see if I have a board here. Do you have something I can set these on? Yeah. Or do you want to just take these on their own?
You want me to take them to the freezer?
Yes, please. I just forgot to grab a little board. All right. So you could do this right on your cookie sheet, but we'll just put this on a board in the freezer. And I'm not actually going to bake these here today just for time's sake because it is a little bit of a process to kind of bake them. That's why I like to do a whole bunch at once. Thank you. But I have some pre-baked that I will show you as we go. Okay, so I'm just going to have Mom throw those in the freezer. Thank you very much for about 15 minutes. All right, so it's 2:15 now. So at 2:30, we will check on those. Now, while those are in the freezer, I'm also going to make the center for the frame and talk to you about how I'm going to go about doing that. And then while they are finished freezing, if it's not quite there yet, then I will just kind of show you the painting process while we're waiting for it before we would go into doing our other steps. All right, and again, if you have any questions, just let me know if you're watching live. I am monitoring that chat. All right. So the other thing that we're going to do is we are going to roll out for the center. You can bake on parchment or foil. I have foil right here next to me, so I'm just going to use that, but a lot of times I use parchment. You could bake on a silicone mat. You could do whatever your normal cookie preference is. But I do want to kind of roll out a piece of dough. Okay, right here on the mat. Grab my little rolling pin. All right, and I usually use my dough sticks for this. I love my Telebaker dough sticks. I do about a 5 millimeter thickness. I'm just going to eyeball it here today, but I'm just going to transfer that to my foil. All right, now I want to cut out the oval that's going to fit inside the frame, but the problem is we don't know what the size of that oval is yet. So what I would have you guys do is once the oval comes out of the freezer, we can, and I will show you that process, we can make a template so that you can cut the center out of this piece. Now I actually have this piece over here that I'm going to use just because it's right next to me and for time's sake, so you guys don't have to wait a few minutes till that cools. I can just show you right now. This is just a plastic version of that frame that I have, so I'm just going to set it on top and use a knife to cut that out. All right. Being careful I don't cut through the foil, but I can transfer it to a new piece if I do. All right, so whether you're using a template or you can actually just use the center or the frame itself, but the problem is when you are handling it a lot, it's really easy to break. So that's why I'm going to show you how to make a template. But that just makes our oval. And we're going to set the frame right around it. So it just kind of gives us that opportunity. I think I did cut through the foil a little bit, so I'm just going to move that over to a new spot, just like that. And we will put everything around it, and that is ready to go. Now you can freeze that as well, just to make sure that it stays situated. I'm not going to worry about that just for right now, because we're going to build on top of it. And I'm just going to cut this foil down, though. Give us a little bit easier piece to work with here. All right, there we go. So I am going to show you the assembly process once those come out, but we still do have about 10 or 12 minutes until those come out. So I'm going to put this off to the side for now, and we're going to kind of jump to the future a little bit for these decorations and kind of decorating that we're going to do, and then I will come back when those are done in the freezer and I will show you how I assemble. So imagine we have gone through some of the other steps now, and then we are going to move to some painting. So let me wipe this mat up really quick. Some of that excess flour away. Okay. My hands as well. Great. All right, so we're going to be moving on to our baked cookie. So by a little bit of demo magic here, we have our baked cookie, which again, I'll show you those steps in a second. But let's start from here. We have our cookie that's all ready to go. It's baked. It is all good. And now I do generally cover some of the finer details with some foil to make sure that they don't get more baked than others. So you can definitely do that. But once we paint it, you're not going to notice any of that anyway. So I am not too worried about the kind of unevenness of some of the thinner and thicker areas baking differently, because we're about to paint that, and I kind of like having that variety in my cookies anyway, of kind of the softer centers. So here's a couple pieces that are separate, okay, from each other. Now I like to bake these all together for this style because I feel like it's a little bit stronger, but if you're not quite sure what you're gonna do, or if you want to just have a little bit easier time with kind of mixing and matching different things, we can definitely use separate pieces, and you can attach them together with a little bit of chocolate, or if it's a display cookie, you could use ice malt, but I wouldn't use ice malt in something someone's going to bite into and not know that there's ice malt in there. So you can use a little bit of chocolate or royal icing and let that dry. And then I think these are cute on their end too, just the little sword in the middle of the frame or the little heart on its own. Okay, like I said, we're going for slight kind of oddities, fantasy inspired designs. So that's the one that I'm going to use for my pieces. All right. Just set these down here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about painting. So like I said, I like to paint the cookie itself with this. So I like the texture of the not raw, it's baked, but the just cookie surface itself. I think that it's really interesting. It's really pretty, and it just, again, it just gives you a different look. It gives you a whole lot more texture to work with. And then instead of flooding and decorating, I'm going to paint on the cookie itself. But what I do is after it's painted, or you could do it before you paint, that's fine too, you can dip the back of the cookie in icing. So I still would dip my cookie. I dip all my cookies because it's a little bit faster, but you could also flood it by hand. Anything's fine. But I would do the back of the cookie. That way you still get that sweetness of the icing and the taste of the icing, but you get the kind of unfinished cookie surface with the really pretty paint and depth that we're going to add to it. So that's just my kind of preferred method of decorating. I think that it comes out really, really pretty and just has my unique touch to it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and airbrush this. Like I said, you could hand paint if you want, but airbrushing is so much faster, and I can get a whole tray of these done in literally minutes. So where it takes a little bit more time to kind of get all the cookies together, you really, really save on time with decorating. So we're going to go ahead and airbrush this. So I have my Dinky Doodle airbrush over here ready to go, and then I have my See Me Color Splash paints that I'm going to use. I'm using Candy Apple Red, Envy Green, and then Base White. We'll finish it off a little bit later, but we're going to do some, actually I'm not using green in the piece, but I'm using brown, which we need red and green to make that color. All right. Perfect. So we're going to start out with just some red on its own, actually, and we'll do the brown afterwards. So I'm going to take my airbrush and just put some of the Candy Apple Red straight over the top of the cookie. Okay, so it's going to get a little bit loud, but I'll try and talk a little bit louder over it. Make sure. There we go. All right. So I don't really want to get the frame. You could mask that off with some paper towels if you wanted to, but I'm just going to kind of go in and add some of the red onto there. And I just kind of put it on a paper towel. You can use a little turntable if you like. I'm not trying to get the cookie to not look like a cookie, so I'm okay with a little bit of the brown of the cookie showing through. But I'm just kind of going over the surface here. And if I overspray onto the background, that's fine because we're going to do that one brown to match kind of the cookie feel. But I'm just adding kind of layers of red, and I love airbrushing on cookies because it's very absorbent since the cookie's so porous, and it takes that color really nicely. So I'm just going from different directions to try and get a full coverage on all the little details. But again, I still want it to look like a cookie, so I'm not stressing about covering the whole surface with an opaque paint. Okay. And because it is 3D, you still get some kind of variation in the color. I didn't really go back into the edges because I'm going to do those brown anyway, and it just gives us a little bit more shading into the piece. So I mostly focused on the top of the heart and just to kind of lay down that initial color. So I would do this assembly line style. I would do all of the cookies the same way. Let me grab a second airbrush here so I can do my next color. All right. Perfect. Okay, so I usually let that dry a second or two, but that's just enough time for me to mix in my next color. So with the semi-color splash colors, you can mix red and green to create brown. So I'm going to do 3 drops of red and 1 drop of green. Now sometimes, especially if I'm working with warmer colors like this, I will add a little bit of extra red. So I'm actually going to do 4 drops of red because I like a slightly more red toned brown. Okay. Let me set this down here. And I'm mixing this right into my airbrush. You can mix it in a cup and then pour it in, whatever you prefer. All right. Maybe. There we go. Perfect. So now I'm going to go kind of in the background, and it'll also grab the edges of that heart. There we go. And I'm going to kind of let it overspray onto the inside of the frame to get it a little bit darker so that when I go over it with my metallic in a bit, it's going to catch really, really nicely on that color and add kind of some depth to it. I'm going to go over the sword as well with some metallic paint. So that means if I overspray onto that, it's no big deal, because metallic paint that I'm going to be using is going to be more opaque. All right, so I just kind of go around it. You can see that already made the red pop really, really nicely. And now I'm just going to go into any indents of the kind of cookie itself. And I'm going to add that brown just to add some kind of definition around the pieces. So anywhere there's a big indent. Okay, and this really brings out the texture of the cookie as well. You're not going to maintain quite as much detail as if you did bake it in the mold or you did more of a smooth finished medium like ice malt or chocolate, but you still get a lot. Plus, we're going to highlight that texture even more with some white paint over the heart. Okay. So pretty much anywhere there's an indent on the heart, so in between some of the little tubes and chambers and ventricles, we're going to add some depth. And I make that pretty harsh because I do like contrast in my pieces, and I feel like it stands out really nicely when there's more contrast. Okay. And don't worry if it gets a little bit muddy looking, because that last layer of white that we're going to do, it definitely will help with the kind of making everything stand out, definition of it. Okay. So again, I would assembly line that where I do all the red, all the brown, and then we're going to go into the metallics that we have. So I do, like I said, add some highlights, but that needs to dry a little bit first. So I'm going to grab some gold first. Okay. And I'm just using some wedding gold from the Sugar Art. You can use any edible metallic paint that you would like. I'm just mixing that with a little bit of alcohol. And I'm using a flat brush for this because I just want to catch the detail. I want to maintain kind of the darkness of the brown cookie around, but I want to paint just the highlights of this frame gold. So I'm not really poking the brush at it. I'm just gliding and sliding the gold over the ridges. See that? And it just matches beautifully with the gold of the cookie. And I'm using a very heavy hand with the gold because I want it to be nice and metallic. I kind of wrap around the sides a little bit. And I feel like that definitely just makes it pop between the two sides. You could do silver, you could do gold, you could do bronze, you could do a color if you wanted to do more of a colorful, whimsical piece, like a blue or a purple. The sky is the limit. All right. There we go. Super pretty. And then I want to make the sword stand out a little bit more, so we're also going to do that same thing with some silver. Let me see if I have my silver here. Take some of that. I'm actually going to use a smaller brush since it's a slightly smaller piece. This is new silver from the Sugar Art. Okay, I'm just going to paint right onto the surface of that cookie. That'll cover up any overspray if I did overspray with the brown or the red, or even when I was painting the gold. And just bring out all of that detail. And again, you can get really detailed with this, especially if it's more of a display cookie. You can go in and paint all the little details of the hilt of the sword, different colors, you know, different gemstones and things set into it. I've done lots of different oddity designs for kind of the style of cookie and some of the oddities markets that I've been doing. So I did some with like snakes inside, some with scorpions. You could do butterflies, moths. There's just so many things that you can do with this kind of style of cookie that just makes everything sort of pop. Okay, I'll do a little bit more on this bottom section. There we go. That really brings it in because all the colors we've been using up to this point have been really warm colors. So having that pop of the really cool tone silver, I think just looks super, super cool. Okay. Hey, Tahisha, welcome. All right, and then the last step to this kind of decorating process is going to be the little bit of white that we're going to add over the surface. Okay, so I'm going to take some of my base white in a little cup here. I'm almost out, so let me see if I can get a little more, kind of bit more out of this container. There we go. And it doesn't take very much, you just need a couple drops. But I'm going to do the same thing we kind of did with the gold, and I'm just going to take a little bit over some of the highlights of the heart. So I'm brushing this on very sparingly, and I'm not really trying to cake the whole thing in white. I just want the brush to naturally catch on some of the detail, and I'm trying anywhere that I can to go against the grain of the texture rather than with the grain, and it just really makes it pop. You can see even from far away there. I'm just doing that on the very highest points of that heart to make sure that they get a little bit brighter, and it doesn't really take away from the colors or cover anything up. It really just pops that detail. And again, that only took, 10 seconds to do. I would do that on the whole tray of the cookies. And then you have your decorated cookie, okay? So very, very fast, very efficient. And then I would dip the back, so I'd let this dry for a little while and then dip the back. That way I can flip it to let it dry. And you can do lots of different patterns on the backs of the pieces as well. You can, dip them marbleized. You can dip them regular. You can flood them too. I mean, you could hand pipe any little details that you wanted in there. You could sprinkle sprinkles over the back. Sky is really the limit design-wise with these, but I kind of wanted to show you guys my method of decorating these cookies. So that is technically from the front our finished cookie, but we are not done yet because we have to actually put the pieces together for the ones that were in the freezer. So I want to show you that. So we're going to kind of go back in time again to put it all together, and I will show you sort of those steps so that when you go to do it, you'll have all of the steps to complete the full process. Okay. All right. Another design option that I really like to do is to add moss onto the pieces. And let me see if I have a little bit of moss here. I do. So what I do is I use green sanding sugar. This is totally optional. You don't have to do this, but especially if you're going for more of like a cottage core sort of cute spring look, you can definitely add moss, and it helps with the covering any like imperfections. If you had a little imperfection or something, you could definitely do that. Let me take my pieces out of the mold since they are going to be getting warmer as they're out at room temperature, but then I will show you that little extra decoration tidbit. Okay. So you have to be really, really gentle when you are unmolding these. So I'm going to go in just tiny bits from the outside first, kind of pulling away, and I'm holding it in the center on both sides. Okay, and I'm just going to make sure that this is kind of unmolding really nicely here. Okay, if I have any little imperfections, I can kind of smooth those with my fingers, or you can trim those away. I'm going to set that on top of the little oval that we did before. Okay, so I set it right on top. Now, I don't glue any of these cookie pieces together because they are going to bake together. So they bake together really, really strong, and it's going to just make sure that everything is fused. If you're having trouble with things staying in place while you're building it like this, you can use a little bit of corn syrup or piping gel in between the cookie pieces. But with this design, since there's nothing really gravity defying, I'm not going to worry about it. So I'm trying to very carefully unmold some of these finer details. A lot of times they do break because I push these molds a lot farther than maybe they're supposed to, but it's okay because the details will just bake back together. So even though I lost a little piece of the sword here, that's okay with me because I'm going to fix that. I'm just going to set that one here for a second because we're actually going to trim that. And then the same thing with the heart. Now, those little kind of ventricles and tubes at the top are definitely more prone to breaking, but again, I'm really not going to stress about that because I can just put it back together. So I'm going to be as careful as I can, but I know I will probably have to add a couple back on. So there is our heart. Okay. And I will just take those out and reassemble. So I'm going to set that guy there. And I'm going to add any of my little tubes. And I'm just sticking them on. Again, you can use a little bit of corn syrup if you feel like you need to stick it into place. But a lot of times you don't even need to worry that far. One little one for this other side. So I'm really just laying them on. Okay, now I want to add the sword. Of course, you can leave it like that too. But with the sword, if I had put the sword down first, it would have made the heart not sit flat. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to cut the sword just a little bit and lay this right kind of on top. Maybe move some pieces out here. Now the handle is a little bit too long. I feel like it's going to stick out too far, so I'm going to actually fake this. I'm going to cut a little gap out of the sword handle and then put the pieces back together. So you can really, really get creative with how you're assembling your different shaped cookies. I do want to try and make sure that the cookie is as flat as possible because when it warms up in the oven, it is going to get soft and it can collapse. So like this little end piece that's sticking up, it doesn't have anything behind it. So what I'll do is I'll just take my foil, or you can take an extra piece of foil and just bulk it up so it has a little bed or like a little pillow to sit on. That way when it gets soft and it wants to fall down, it's not going to fold and bend around the edge of the frame. And then that's going to be way too long for the bottom, so I'm just going to figure out how long I want it to be. And I'm just meeting that blade right up to the cookie here and just laying it and kind of tucking the end underneath so you can't tell that I had actually cut it. Just like that. So we're kind of making like a cookie collage in a way of putting all of these different elements together, and then once it bakes, they're all going to fuse really, really nicely. So again, I would probably put this back in the freezer unless you're super fast or the piece isn't as detailed. You want this though to be as frozen as possible, and since these have been out for a little while, I would definitely want to refreeze it since they're not going to be baked in the mold. So I'll put it in for another 10 minutes or so, and that would also give me an opportunity to make more pieces. So if you only have one set of molds, multiple sets can help if you're doing a lot, but one set of molds is going to be really easy to just assembly line it again. So I just make my next ones, and then once I have a whole tray of the cookies that I would just again keep in the freezer in between using, and then I would bake it. And now when you bake this, you want to go just about 5 minutes at a time. Any little fine details, I would take some extra pieces of foil and just create like a little tent over top. So I don't necessarily do it over the whole cookie, although you could if you're having issues with really uneven temperatures. But I would just create kind of these little covers for the finer edges of the cookies, and that will just keep the direct heat of the oven from going directly on the surface of that piece. Now, because these are all going to fuse into one, they actually bake a lot more even than if you were going to do things individually. So when you do things individually, they're going to bake a lot faster. But because the sword, even though it's thin, but because it's next to and fusing with all of that thicker cookie dough, it does definitely help to regulate the temperature. But again, once you kind of paint it, you're not going to notice that at all. So obviously you don't want to burn the cookie, but if it's a little bit more toasty on the edges, I've never noticed any difference when eating it. It all just kind of blends together. So that is how I do my 3D cookies. So from kind of the molding and baking process where we started to the decorating and painting process. And even, I mean, if you painted this all in gold and took out a lot of the shading steps, I think that would be beautiful too, or all in silver, more like a wall plaque or, like a crest suit of arms or something like that, would be really, really cool. So tons and tons of different things. And then, like I was saying, if you wanted to add another kind of little hint of more of a spring inspired piece or a little bit more like cottage core, I'm going to use a little bit of my sanding sugar. This is actually white sanding sugar that I tinted with a drop of the green Envy or Envy Green Semi Color Splash, just a drop in the bag, and I scrunched it all up. But of course, you can use actual green sanding sugar if you have it. I just had run out. I'm going to use a little bit of piping gel to attach this. You can use a little bit of icing. You can use some chocolate. If you're doing an outdoor market, at least in Florida, I try to not use chocolate because it will just melt back down. But I'm just going to take little kind of dabs of piping gel here and there, mostly on the frame. And I think that it just adds a really, really pretty touch. I believe I also added a drop of brown, so I actually mixed brown color separately with the Semi Color Splash and added a drop of that in to the sanding sugar. You can also use like light brown sugar for this. You can use regular granulated sugar, whatever you have on hand. That way it wasn't too bright of a green because I didn't want this to be intensely bright. I just wanted a little bit. And this adds some color into the piece as well. I'll hold it up to the camera in a second so you can see. I'm just using that, and then you can use a clean paintbrush to just brush off any excess. But this is great if you had any weird like gaps that formed in the cookie that you weren't able to fix or that kind of show up during the baking process, or if you have any miss kind of steps with the paint and you get a little smudge of color somewhere you didn't want it. The moss is really, really cute, and I feel like it adds some nice texture to it as well. Makes it look very overgrown, kind of adds to that fantasy look for this design. Okay, but you can add more 3D decorations on top now with like royal icing transfers or piped decorations. You can use edible images with this. There's just tons and tons of ways that you could change this up for different designs. And like I said, I would dip the backs of them in icing, so you still have the icing on there, but it just gives you a little bit more freedom to decorate the front so that it's not perfectly smooth. I love texture. and just kind of contrast and detail. So having that rather than just a super smooth cookie, I think is just more my personal style. But I think it's something you can definitely create and kind of make your own and adapt to what you prefer to do. And you can mix and match these with, just the typical kind of royal icing flooded cookies would be really pretty as well. If you didn't want to do obviously a whole set of these for time or price, constraints, you could definitely do one or two as the kind of the focal point in the set, and then do the other ones just a little bit simpler and more coordinating to the cookie. You can use the frame mold and then take an edible image and put a message in the center of it, or you can create more like a magic mirror. Again, the possibilities are just so endless with this, but I really, really like how these come out, and I've done a bunch of different variations of these for different like oddities markets and orders and things like that. All right. Perfect. So let me know if anybody has any questions. And again, if you're watching, you can definitely message me afterwards with any questions that you have if you're watching later, or you're going back to this to reference it and are working on it actually live then, and then have a question once you actually start doing it. You definitely can. And then I just wash my molds. Of course, since there was cookie dough in them, I'll wash my molds. You never want to try and like scrub them with anything porous or really rough, but you can use some soapy water and then just kind of rinse them off afterwards and let them air dry. All right, perfect. Yeah, so thank you, Mom. Just wrote in the comments, bookmark this private link for future reference. So this is you guys' for life. You get lifetime access to this, so you can definitely bookmark this. It'll make it a little bit easier to find and to go back to, and that way you can go back to it. It'll be this same link. So sorry about that confusion in the beginning with the different link, but it will be this link now, and that will bring you back to the replay. As soon as I end the stream, it will be available. All right. Perfect. So I am working on some spring themed tutorials. Those should be out very, very soon. I'm just finalizing the details and the projects on those, but I'm very excited about that. And I will have lots more lives and tutorials coming out in the coming weeks. But I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for this tutorial. And it's almost Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day.
And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Okay. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.